Mr. Annan, before the break we were talking about Rwanda and Somalia and whether in cases where there's not a national security interest of a major power, you talked about orphan crisis and whether UN peacekeeping operations can have a true champion. Of course, a year and a half after Rwanda we had the massacre in Srebrenica. Was Bosnia though a little different because it was in the heart of Europe and there was more of a security interest, at least of European powers, to get involved?
No, you're absolutely right. Bosnia was different. Bosnia had the attention. Bosnia had the forces required that Rwanda did not have. There were divisions between the member states, but of a different kind. The Europeans had deployed troops through the UN peacekeeping and subsequently through NATO. Mladic, who was leading the Serbian army, was rather cynical and a brutal man and had taken UN's peacekeepers hostage. And this really unnerved the governments. That's also another aspect of peacekeeping. We do not prepare the population for the possibility that there could be risks. And we give the impression it's always risk-free. So when you get into these situations where either some are killed or are taken hostage, the population gets very upset, the politicians panic and often say, bring the boys home. So there is that weakness in the peacekeeping operation. If it's a national effort, they don't do that. They would take the casualties and in fact sometimes even reinforce the troops so that they can get the work done. But in Bosnia, what had happened was, at one stage when it became clear that firmer action needed to be taken against the Bosnian Serb army, the governments with troops on the ground, mainly the European government, did not want to use air power because they felt it could place their men and women deployed there at risk. The US, which had no troops on the ground, wanted to use air power, and this led to a long standoff until that was resolved. In fact, I remember one of the UN commanders, General Cotte, a Frenchman, in an interview saying, we need troops now. The US are saying they will come when there is peace, and this is not very courageous. And this made my good friend Madeleine Albright absolutely furious. He said he cannot say that. And in fact, it was not correct for him, but that was a sort of tension and the feeling that existed at the time. But when the issue was resolved and air power was brought to bear, it broke the back of the Serbian army and eventually led to the Dayton peace talks with Secretary Christopher and Richard Holbrooke, who pushed for the settlement.
Before Dayton, of course, though, we had in July of 1995 the forces of Ratko Mladic overran Srebrenica.
That's correct.
And United Nations peacekeepers stood by and let it happen.
I would not use the phrase United Nations peacekeepers stood by and let it happen. We had a Dutch companies, a Dutch group, rather small group. This is also part of the problem, in the sense that I was very much involved when they started talking of establishing safe areas. I had my commanders do a study of what would be required to make that safe area truly safe. There were two things they suggested. One, it has to be wide enough in diameter to get it outside beyond the range of Serb shelling, so that they cannot shell in and attack the people. Second, it will require 34,600 troops. The member states were having none of that. In fact, they changed the mandate and there was no word of protection or anything in it, saying we will establish the safe area. They wanted the weakest option, took the weakest option of 7,600 for the areas. And when you do that, you are not able, and the diameter wasn't wide enough. They didn't have the resources to do it properly, and the peacekeepers who were, and there were several areas agreed to. So the peacekeepers who were there in Srebrenica, when they were overwhelmed by the Serbian army led by Mladic, really could not stand up, could not defend themselves, much less the local population. And I believe
it made a mockery of the idea of a safe haven.
Oh, I won't argue with that. And this is the other point I was going to make, because in effect, if you say that you are bringing in people to protect you and assure your safety, and we have a safe haven, and UN troops are, the sense the people get is, finally, we're going to be safe. There is a safe haven, the UN troops are here, and nothing would happen. And to have allowed that expectation to stand, rather than being realistic and lowering expectation and explaining to the people and the public what we can do and not do, is part of the problem with the UN peacekeeping. Because I saw it in the Middle East, in Lebanon, southern Lebanon. When you put a UN patrol here, 3 days later it's become a village, because people gather around it thinking it will give them some safety, or they will be visible.
But in the case of Srebrenica then, you don't think the Dutch peacekeepers could have done anything more than they did?
They did not have the resources. They could have fought, but they didn't have the sort of weapons that are required. They were completely outgunned and outrun.
But when the Dutch government had its own commission into what had happened in Srebrenica, the whole government resigned. I mean, the Dutch clearly felt they were ashamed of what they'd done.
Yeah, but it was also an impossible situation to put those troops in. I used to talk to quite a lot of the commanders, and I think I've made this point earlier, where they would say, yes, we can stand and fight and take them on today. Let's say you have 1,000 Dutch soldiers in the enclave, and they come with reinforcements of 10,000 tomorrow, and they have no means of getting reinforcements. And at that time, the air cover wasn't that effective. And so the commanders sometimes make judgments that we on the outside may not agree with, but they also know the mandate they have. What is important is, when we are going to take on these operations, we should go in with the necessary force to be able to get the work done. In fact, in peacekeeping, we have a theory that you sometimes have to show force in order not to use force. I mean, for example, when the US went to Somalia, they arrived massively with all the resources. There was no way the Somali rebels were going to take them on. So you show force in order not to use force. But the UN often doesn't have that force even to show. We don't have force to get the essential work done. And the story I was going to tell was, in Srebrenica, we got the minimum, for the safe areas, we got the minimum resources required. And the mandate was defined to read, the peacekeepers should use their presence to dissuade attacks on the enclaves. And the member states arguing, we haven't asked you to protect them because we know you don't have the means. And this is why we've chosen our words very carefully. Use your presence to dissuade. Behaving as if the Mladic and his team are so well behaved, so gentlemanly, that if they see a UN blue helmet, they won't shoot. It was an illusion.
But you stand by the peacekeepers who were there, the Dutch peacekeeping operation that was there. You don't think they should have done more than they did?
I really do not see how much more they could. After the fact, and in hindsight, people come up with all sorts of things they should have done and they could have done. They could have fought. and taking great risk for themselves and the others. And I'm sure they would have done it if they were assured of reinforcement